Hello everyone, and welcome to Intel Talks, our webinar series on business and technology. Today we discuss data analytics platform in pharma with Matthias Falk. Matthias is an engagement director and cloud engineer for one of our pharma's clients. He has been building data and analytics platform and advising clients across various industries over the last years. My name is Billy. I will be your host and moderator for today. For those of you who are new to the series, we are Unitate, a Swiss data analytics and AI company driving the adoption of data science in the industry and committing to sharing our best practices. Decision for you, therefore, please ask your question by commenting on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. We are live, ready. Let's give the floor to Matthias. It's for you, Matthias.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Billy. Yeah, as Billy said, first of all, thanks everybody for joining today's session. My name is Matthias. By training a cloud and DevOps engineer, so the talk today will not purely be business related, but I also try to share some technical best practices around data and analytics platforms in the pharma industry. And yeah, super stumped to get started. And with that, let's jump right into it. So can everybody see the screen? Perfect. So we at Unit 8 and are engaged with pharma clients and also other clients from different industries in building data and analytics platforms for the past years. And what we see happening today, I mean, this is no news. Pharma companies and also other companies try to create insights from their data to basically derive insights in various domains. And that can be R&D, that can be enablement functions such as HR, but that can also be supply chain or healthcare use cases. So a very, very broad, let's say, set of use cases, domains, and also challenges that they need to solve. And then I think a second interesting trend, I mean, that's also no news, is the paradox of choice. The technology stack is really getting more and more complex. So really choosing the right tools is already a challenge. And then in another trend that we are seeing, that literally every big pharma company is currently building its own data and analytics ecosystem in some form. And also feel free to drop actually your challenges if you have any in the chat, in the comments. That would be really interesting to me as well. I can try to answer your questions, obviously, throughout the presentation. And super interested in what challenges you face. So another thing that I see personally is that also with the background of building such platforms, providing a company-wide data and analytics ecosystem isn't easy. Right on the left side, you can see that the modern data stack is kind of mainstream now. So there are obviously tools all around the market to solve very specific challenges. Some platforms which try to solve broader challenges. And also from a McKinsey article, analytics across the pharma value chain, as I said, is very, very diversified and very different depending on in which stage of the value chain you are. So let's say that the technology challenge combined with the variety of use cases and business challenges that need to be solved basically result in the paradox of choice that I mentioned. So which tools do you select to basically in your organization solve your business challenges? And what I brought today with me is kind of a data platform archetype, right? So every, from my perspective, data and analytics platform somewhat follows this schema. There are data sources. There's some form of ingestion, whether that's ingesting data from the on-premise data center into the cloud or from the third-party data sources or public data sources into the, let's say, collection and storage mechanism. Then there's the processing step in between where data gets validated, cleaned, transformed. So where all the ETL or ELT is happening. And then in the end, I think the most important part also in terms of creating insights and value out of that data is simply the consumption. And I will come to that in a bit as well, how that can look like. So that's, from my perspective, a typical platform archetype. And with that archetype in general, there are also a few challenges that I would like to go with you through today. So challenge number one is, how do I scale my platform in the organization? And by scaling, I not only mean technical scalability. So, right, how do I ensure that I can ingest more data, ensure that I can consume more data, onboard more users onto the platform, but also how do I make sure that adoption throughout the company is scaled. The second challenge from my perspective is automation. So when we talk about cloud data and analytics platforms, infrastructure as code is a huge challenge, but also a huge enabler, right? And then the third challenge, as I said, it's not only about technology and processes, but it's also about the organization and the people that actually use the platform. And what I always say is that essentially your platform is kind of a product that people will either use or not use depending on how good and how easy to use it is. So the third challenge to enable your organization and your people is very key from my perspective. Cool. And with that, let's jump into challenge number one. How do we get from experimenting to scaling? And why should we even bother about scaling, right? Why is it so hard? What I've seen in the past, and I myself built a lot of POCs, not only for data and analytics platforms, but also for use cases, right? And I think a lot of organizations or organizational units, they land in the POC trap. So they start building POCs. Some of them are working, some of them are showing value, but then it's really, really hard for the use case team to get out of that POC trap and productionize their use cases. Why? Because most often the underlying infrastructure, the data and analytics platforms, don't make it easy enough for those use case teams to basically go into production and scale. Then I think another challenge when it comes to scaling is that in most cases, there are a lot of domain-specific platforms that try to solve a very specific problem, such as a platform that is specific to drug development, right? It needs to follow certain regulations and so on. But how can I make sure that I essentially build a general purpose platform which is beneficial to my entire organization in the end, that wants to deal with data and wants to run analytics use cases? And then obviously the third challenge that comes with scaling is if you build super domain specific platforms with a very specific tool set, it also requires very specific skills. And not, let's say, the majority of the organization won't be able, or they won't all become cloud engineers, they won't all become data scientists. So we also need to make sure that we can essentially accommodate different personas and different user types on our platforms. And that's essentially why I also think that, and what we've done with our clients in the past and still do, is to really identify who are our users, who will use our platform. And different users usually mean different environments, different, in that sense, different technical environments. So here I brought basically 3 examples. I know there are way more, but essentially if we have data engineers, data scientists, and maybe specialist teams such as clinical statisticians, they all have different requirements regarding their tooling, and they all have also different requirements in solving their business challenges. And we, from the perspective of a data and analytics platform provider or data and analytics platform builder in the organization, are basically responsible for accommodating for those requirements and making sure that our data engineers are happy, our data scientists are happy, and that they have the infrastructure and the tools that they need to basically do their job, right? And what different environments could look like. There's this famous Uber data science workbench. I always take that as an example for, let's say, experimenting. I know it's not pharma specific, but it still can be obviously applied, because there are data scientists and engineers and data analysts in the organization who essentially have a need for such environments to basically quickly experiment, to run ad hoc analysis, to model really short-lived models, and mainly work on reporting and dashboarding. From the get-go, there's no intention to productionize such a solution. But then there's obviously also the need to scale use cases, right? That's what I meant by the POC trap. How do you make sure that once a POC is successful, it also can be implemented? It can be implemented at scale, so it can serve the entire organization or a specific part of the organization. How can you make it easy for those use case teams to have an end-to-end production-ready use case environment in the cloud, for example, or on-premise, depending on the model that you want to choose. And these environments are really tailored to model deployment, right? So how can I serve model APIs? How can I integrate it into my business processes? How can I feed back decisions coming out of that model into all my business processes, so that in the end we can actually take action from our model results, so to say. Cool. And then challenge number 2, how do we come from regulating to automating in such an environment? Because obviously, and I think that's also the biggest difference of pharma platforms, data analytics platforms in the pharma industry compared to other industries. So there's heavy regulation, depending obviously on the use cases. There's the GxP regulation, and then there are many other regulations which have to follow certain assumptions, certain standards, processes, documentation, and so on. But we still want to basically be able to quickly iterate on the platform, implement new features, make our customers happy, while, of course, also adhering to those non-functional requirements, such as regulation and then also security. When it comes to automation, I think best practices are really that if we want to deploy infrastructure and if we want to deliver our infrastructure in the end as a product to our customers, we really need to understand that infrastructure as code is basically the vehicle to ship our product to our customers. And also, I think if you really try to scale your platform, you will end up with a lot of infrastructure as code pipelines, right? There will be networks deployed, there will be data storage deployed, there will be ETL jobs deployed, and so on and so on. And all of that is basically, in the ideal case, written as infrastructure as code. And I think a good rule of thumb is to separate pipelines and resources based on the frequency of changes. So one example would be, I deploy a core networking piece. I deploy it once and it almost never changes, right? That should go in a separate pipeline compared to I deploy my permissions as infrastructure as code and I continuously need to update them, maybe multiple times a day. That definitely should be in another pipeline to basically separate also the duties of the resources and also based on the frequency. And then another, let's say, best practice for automation, but not only for automation, I think it's a general trend that we see in the cloud is the shift left. And I don't only mean shift left in terms of security, but also in terms of testing, right? So how can we give more responsibility and catch errors and configuration errors earlier in the software development lifecycle, or in our case, infrastructure development lifecycle, to make sure our platform runs smoothly and also is more secure and more stable in the end. And for that, I brought an example today. So basically, this is a bit of code. It's a typical, in this case, it's CloudFormation from AWS, but this essentially can be any form of infrastructure as code, framework, right? Could be Terraform, could be Biceps, could be anything. In the end, what we have on the left side, as cloud engineers, we essentially define resources or infrastructure that will get deployed in a certain cloud environment. And then there are tools out there. In this case, it's CloudFormation NAG, which is kind of a security scanning tool, which helps the developer or the cloud engineer already before even committing to the repository to catch errors. Right, and usual checks are identity and access management rules that are too permissive, that kind of give access to everything. Security groups in terms of networking that maybe are too permissive and allow traffic from everywhere. Access logs or certain, let's say, non-functional standards also from the IT security perspective that have to be enabled. But in the development lifecycle are essentially small flags that have to be set in the infrastructure, such as encryption, password literals that are exposed. And then we can use those also open source tools to basically scan our templates and catch these errors even before we are committing. So in this case, I think there's one failure and a couple of warnings because that security group here hasn't been configured correctly. So there's an egress rule missing, and it basically allows traffic to go everywhere. And then also there's a shift left in terms of testing, right? And I think if we talk about infrastructure, data and analytics platform in general, we have to understand that our infrastructure is essentially the code. And also our infrastructure is what in a lot of previous scenarios would be our application code. And we treat infrastructure the same way as we treat applications, right? We have source control where we version and control all our templates and all our configurations, also to ensure traceability, also to ensure compliance and auditing, right? I can simply go back in my commit history and my pipelines that have been published and can see what's going on in terms of infrastructure changes. And then the second step is obviously building. That's what I was referring to previously. In that build phase, we would also have static analysis. We would lint our templates to ensure they are written correctly. We would have these security scans in place, even before committing and during the build phase to basically catch errors before we deploy them. And then step 3 is testing. And testing is really not that easy in the infrastructure work because essentially what we need to do is we need to build it and then we need to deploy it to a clean environment, do our integration tests, right? So an example would be we deploy a simple virtual machine to an environment that is relatively clean. We run our tests, for example, if we can access certain networks that we want to access. If the tests are successful, we destroy the infrastructure again and then deploy to the correct target environment. And then as a last step, we can promote our infrastructure, as I said, to the actual live environments. So that is how we would apply the development lifecycle to our infrastructure of the data and analytics platform. Cool. And then obviously, in terms of pharma and healthcare, we have a platform in a regulated environment, and ideally we also that's what I was referring to in the beginning. We don't want to have narrow scope data and analytics platforms, but essentially give everybody in the company the opportunity to run their use cases, also if they are GXP use cases who need to follow certain standards. And what we can do in terms of the GXP qualification and validation approach is that as the data platform provider, we can essentially do installation qualification and continuous qualification of the underlying infrastructure, right? That would include platform management, shared services such as security services and monitoring, the ingestion infrastructure and pipelines, as well as any data lake components. And then on top, we have basically from the platform archetype, the consumers. And our consumers in this case could be data science workbenches, could be end-to-end use cases, that can be third-party applications or any kind of APIs. And that would fall into the section of validation in that case. All right. And then I think there's a third challenge that I mentioned in the beginning. How do we get from controlling our users to enabling them, right? Because I believe in the beginning, especially if the maturity of the organization is not that high with platforms in the cloud, we really have to make sure that we do things on three fronts. And this is basically on the technology, processes, and people front. Because what I've seen happening is that there's a fear that people might not use the platform as intended, right? But people will always find a way to basically use the platform as it's intended to be used. And I think from a technology perspective, what we can do is to put certain guardrails in place, right? On Azure or AWS, that can be policies or permissions that basically dictate from an organizational level into subscriptions or accounts what people can do and what they can't do, right? So that we have a good understanding of use case governance and usage governance. And then obviously also the second factor is to implement cost controls. Because that can also become quite quickly that we have inefficient processes, maybe there's unused infrastructure still running, and if we don't monitor it, if we don't have those cost controls in place, then obviously also the bill and the spending can get quite high quite quickly. Then from a process perspective, we have those consumer environments. So we have data science and use case environments. And essentially these are our products, right? And the more people we onboard onto the platform, the more efficient also our operations processes need to get. Because simply the time from requesting access to such an environment to be able to start working, that's what we really need to get good at. So that needs to be as easy as possible. That needs to be as quick as possible to really also give the users that kind of aha moment that our organizational processes can be smooth and they quickly get access and can get to the core of what they want to do, basically to solve their business challenges. And that's also what I mean by simplifying access and productionization of use cases. So if we can quickly give someone access in a controlled way, obviously, and they have the technical and procedural baseline to go to production, that's perfect. And that's what we are aiming for. And then in terms of people, it's relatively hard to say, okay, we selected our platforms, we selected our vendors, and now everybody needs to become an expert in technology X and Y. And then to dictate it to the people, that's where I think a lot of friction occurs. And what we, in contrast, need to do, from my perspective, is really to enable the people that are working with the platform, right? So that's obviously the DevOps team of the platform itself, that is more in the provider, let's say, role, but also the users. So our data scientists, our data engineers, they need to get comfortable with, for example, using a certain cloud vendor instead of a tool that they've been using on premise for the past 1.5 or 2 years. And that's for me really part of the product, right? So if I want to purchase a SaaS product, I also need to be able to read documentation about it. I need to be able to be onboarded. I want to have trainings around it. And the same way I would treat data and analytics platforms in an organizational context, right? So what we do is to really provide guidelines, best practices, and try to create communities around certain use cases or around certain environments, such as the data science workbench, and help them with the right tools, right? Such as Stack Overflow to really log issues and also to take off that operational burden of the DevOps team. And yeah, last but not least, definitely your platform in the end is a product that users will either use or not, depending on how well they kind of can cope with it, on how well they get onboarded and are able to use it. Perfect. I think then we are actually close to conclusion. My key takeaways for data and analytics platforms in the pharma industry are three things, right? So the first one is make productionization easy to avoid that POC trap, to be able to generate more value out of the use cases. The second one is automate, and also try to enable your teams to kind of pick up those infrastructure as code, best practices. And then the third one, again, regarding GXP and regulation, document, because your auditors will definitely be happy if you do that. That's it from my side. So happy to take any questions, stories, or challenges that you might face. All right. Jagosh is asking, which platform vendors do you currently notice in the market? I mean, personally, me as a cloud engineer, working in the DACH region, I think the three main players are still AWS, Microsoft, and somewhat GCP. But we also see more, let's say, special purpose data platforms and data engineering platforms such as Palantir, Snowflake, and these kind of platforms. I can't hear you, Billy. Are you still on mute?
Sorry, Matthias. I think we have another question. How do you handle data privacy when deploying to public clouds?
So I think data privacy is obviously a challenge that you need to solve technically, right? So one technical challenge is how do you make sure, for example, that your storage, whether it's blob storage or S3 or whatever, it is not public, right? It's not accessible to the public in most use cases, that you have the right policies and permissions in place to kind of prevent that. And then obviously also another aspect is to segregate your data depending on its level of confidentiality, right? So that you have that you do distinguish between secure data, confidential data, public data, and so on, and that those don't get stored in the same, let's say, place. And then obviously also working together with the data privacy teams. There are features already on the cloud which, for example, provide things as identifying PII data, so personal identifiable information, that you have anonymization mechanisms in place before you actually store the data. Now,
thanks, Matthias. I hope it answered your question, Thanos. I was wondering, because you gave a lot of insightful tips about starting building your data platform and scaling, and I was wondering maybe you could clarify a bit what skills do you need to build and operate such a platform?
So in my experience, definitely having skilled cloud and DevOps engineers is a good start, right? So you really need to have architecture understanding. So how do certain components interact with each other? What happens if you change certain configurations? That's purely for, let's say, for the building part. And then for the operating part, obviously also knowledge about the cloud that you're building on is key. And I'm a big fan of DevOps, so not building something and then handing it over, but doing it as a continuous process is really cool. Then there's a question, is there an SLO with the cloud providers that the data won't leave the country or continent? I mean, yes, data residency itself is also a topic, right? But that's essentially also a good example of just configure your infrastructure, right? So only because you store data in a certain country or in a certain, let's say, region on the cloud doesn't mean if you misconfigure it that it will land in another region, right? So there's both, let's say, this shared responsibility model. Obviously, if you really store it in the EU or in Switzerland or Germany or wherever, obviously the cloud provider has kind of that shared responsibility model that they ensure it. But on the other hand, misconfigurations can also lead to problems on that front.
I hope it answers the question. And if you have any more, you can ask them right now. Our session goes to the end, but if anyway we close the session, you have question pop into your mind, feel free to write them in the comment of the platform on LinkedIn, on YouTube. We're checking that, but also write to us on at united.com, info@united.com, and then we'll do our best to reach out to you. If you don't have any more questions, we are closing the session for today. I want to thank you all for participating with us. Thank you, especially Matthias, for the insightful section. And you can follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter to be updated about the next section. And yes, we have been recognized #1 fastest growing company in Switzerland by Financial Times. We have an article on our website about that. It's good to brag sometime. And but anyway, you can watch all the past episodes of our United Talks on our YouTube channel on our website. That's all for today. We wish you all a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.